From the air, Lake Mead barely looks real anymore. A giant pale bathtub ring wraps around the cliffs like a scar baked into the desert. Old marinas now sit stranded far from the waterline. Sun-bleached boats rest in dry mud where deep water used to exist. Entire sections of shoreline look abandoned, almost post-apocalyptic. And the unsettling part is, this isn't happening to one lake. Lake Powell is shrinking too. The two largest reservoirs in the United States, massive artificial lakes built to control the Colorado River and support millions of people across the American West, are losing water at historic speeds. Most people see this as a drought story, a crisis about reservoirs running dry. But lately, scientists have started paying attention to something stranger happening underneath the West itself. Because when enormous amounts of water disappear from the landscape, the Earth responds physically. The crust bends. Pressure changes underground. Stress redistributes through rock layers deep beneath the surface. And in some regions, the land may actually begin shifting upwards slightly after decades of being compressed beneath the immense weight of stored water. That sounds almost unbelievable at first, until you realize how massive these reservoirs really are. Lake Mead alone once held so much water it measurably weighed down parts of the crust beneath Nevada and Arizona. Think about that for a second. Humans built structures large enough to physically affect the earth beneath them. Now those same reservoirs are shrinking rapidly. And researchers are studying whether the sudden reduction in pressure could influence tiny earthquakes, land deformation, and geological stress patterns across parts of the Southwest. Not giant Hollywood-style earthquakes ripping cities apart overnight. At least, not according to current evidence. The concern is quieter than that. Slow crustal adjustment happening beneath a region already struggling with drought, groundwater depletion, and climate stress. And honestly, the timing feels unsettling. Because the American West is already under pressure from almost every direction. Cities pumping groundwater faster than nature can replace it. Extreme heat intensifying across deserts year after year. Now scientists are discovering the landscape itself may be responding geologically to the disappearance of water across the region. That's what makes Lake Mead and Lake Powell psychologically strange. They were supposed to stabilize the West, support growth across Nevada, Arizona, California, and beyond. Instead, the reservoirs themselves may now be revealing how fragile the region actually is. And tonight, while millions of people across Las Vegas, Phoenix, and the Southwest continue using water drawn from the Colorado River system, the giant reservoirs holding back the desert are still shrinking silently under the heat. To understand why scientists are paying attention to Lake Mead and Lake Powell now, you first have to understand how enormous these reservoirs really are. These are not ordinary lakes. They are giant engineered bodies of water created by some of the most ambitious construction projects in American history. Lake Mead formed after the construction of Hoover Dam during the Great Depression. Lake Powell came later with Glen Canyon Dam. Together, they transformed the Colorado River into the hydraulic backbone of the American Southwest. Without them, cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix could never have grown the way they did. Millions of people depend on this system every single day. Entire desert economies exist because engineers figured out how to trap and redistribute the Colorado River across one of the driest regions in North America. And for decades, the system looked almost unstoppable. Huge blue reservoirs stretching through canyon landscapes like artificial inland seas. Tourist marinas floating beneath towering red cliffs. Massive hydroelectric turbines humming inside dams built to tame the desert itself. But hidden underneath all that engineering success was something people rarely thought about. An unbelievable amount of weight. 1 cubic meter of water weighs about a metric ton. Now imagine billions upon billions of tons sitting inside giant reservoirs pressing down onto Earth's crust year after year. Scientists discovered long ago that large reservoirs can physically deform the ground beneath them. The crust flexes slightly under pressure. Tiny fractures deep underground respond to changing loads. In some cases, reservoirs have even been linked to small earthquake activity through a process called reservoir-induced seismicity. That phrase sounds technical, but the idea is pretty simple. When enormous amounts of water suddenly accumulate behind dams, the weight changes stress conditions underground. Water can also seep into deep rock layers and faults, altering friction inside the crust itself. Most of the earthquakes associated with this process are relatively small, but the phenomenon is real enough that scientists monitor it worldwide near major reservoirs. And honestly, Hoover Dam engineers were already observing strange geological responses nearly a century ago. As Lake Mead filled during the 1930s, researchers detected subtle seismic activity and crustal adjustments around the region. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to confirm the Earth responds physically when humans move that much water into one place. Now, here's the unsettling twist. For decades, scientists mostly studied what happens when reservoirs fill. Today, researchers are increasingly interested in the opposite question. What happens when the water disappears? Because Lake Mead and Lake Powell are no longer stable, giant reservoirs sitting near full capacity. The drought across the American West has drained enormous amounts of water from both systems. Shorelines keep retreating. Water pressure on the crust keeps decreasing, and the earth underneath may be slowly adjusting again. Some researchers compare it loosely to removing weight from a compressed mattress. The surface can rebound slightly upward after pressure decreases, not dramatically enough for ordinary people to notice directly. But sensitive instruments can detect tiny changes in land elevation and crustal stress. And the Southwest already sits atop a complicated geological landscape filled with faults, fractured rock, and tectonic stress left over from millions of years of crustal stretching. Nevada especially is one of the most faulted regions in North America. The crust there is already under tension naturally. So scientists are asking an uncomfortable question. Could rapid water loss across giant reservoirs subtly influence fault behavior or seismic patterns in the surrounding region? Right now, most evidence points towards small-scale effects rather than catastrophic ones. But researchers are watching carefully because the American West is entering environmental conditions modern infrastructure was never fully designed for. Long-term mega-drought, and now possibly even measurable geological responses as the reservoirs themselves continue disappearing. That's what makes Lake Mead and Lake Powell feel different lately. For decades, scientists focused mostly on the dangers of too much water. Floods, dam failures, reservoir pressure building against rock walls. Now the American West is entering the opposite experiment. What happens when giant reservoirs start vanishing? Because Lake Mead and Lake Powell are not dropping a few feet during a normal dry season. They've been losing enormous volumes of water across years of extreme drought and overuse. And the changes are becoming visible everywhere. Old boat ramps end in dirt. Marinas sit stranded in shrinking coves. Canyon walls, once hidden underwater, now stand exposed beneath massive white mineral scars called bathtub rings. The landscape almost looks like the water is retreating from civilization itself. But underground, something else may be happening too. As reservoir levels fall, the crust beneath them experiences less pressure. Tiny adjustments begin occurring deep underground. The Earth slowly reacts to the changing load. Scientists call part of this process isostatic rebound. That sounds complicated, but the basic idea is simple. When enough weight gets removed from the surface, the crust can gradually rise or flex upward slightly. The same thing happened after Ice Age glaciers melted thousands of years ago. Massive sheets of ice disappeared, and the land beneath them slowly rebounded upward over time. Now, obviously, Lake Mead is not an Ice Age glacier, but the principle still applies. Large amounts of weight disappearing from the surface can alter stress underground. And in regions already filled with faults and fractured crust, researchers want to understand how sensitive those systems might be. Especially in the Basin and Range Province across Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, one of the most geologically stretched regions in North America. The crust there is already being pulled apart naturally over geological time. Faults crisscross huge sections of the desert. Some remain inactive for thousands of years, others still produce small earthquakes regularly. That's why scientists monitor even tiny changes carefully. Not because they expect the reservoirs themselves to suddenly trigger giant earthquakes. Current evidence doesn't support that kind of dramatic scenario. The concern is subtler, ground deformation, the kind of slow geological reactions most people would never notice directly. But sensitive instruments do. GPS stations across the West now measure land movement down to millimeter-scale precision. Satellite radar tracks deformation across enormous areas of terrain. Researchers compare seismic activity patterns against changing water levels inside reservoirs and aquifers. And honestly, some of the findings are strange. In parts of California and Arizona, groundwater removal has already caused sections of land to sink dramatically over time. Entire aquifers beneath the Southwest are collapsing after decades of overpumping. That process is called subsidence. Once underground sediments compress too much, some aquifers permanently lose storage capacity forever. The ground physically changes shape, infrastructure slowly destabilizes. So scientists increasingly see water loss not just as a climate problem, but as a geological one too. The Earth itself is responding to the redistribution of water across the West, and reservoirs are only part of the story. Because while surface reservoirs shrink, cities and farms often compensate by pumping even more groundwater from underground aquifers. That creates another layer of stress beneath the region. Water leaves the subsurface, sediments compact, land sinks, pressure fields underground shift again. It's basically a giant environmental balancing act happening beneath the Southwest in slow motion. And the unsettling part is how modern this entire experiment is. Humans massively reshaped the hydrology of the American West within barely a century. Now, climate pressure is exposing how interconnected everything really became. Water systems. None of them exist separately anymore, and scientists still don't fully know what the long-term consequences look like if the reservoirs continue shrinking for decades. Because the West was engineered around the assumption that the Colorado River system would remain relatively reliable, that assumption is starting to crack, and beneath the deserts tonight, the ground itself may still be adjusting to the disappearance of water. The scary part is that the reservoirs are not shrinking in isolation. The entire western United States is already under environmental stress almost everywhere you look. Rivers are weakening. Snowpack in the mountains has become less predictable. Extreme heat waves now last longer and arrive earlier in the year. Meanwhile, millions of people continue depending on water systems designed around 20th century climate assumptions that may no longer exist. That pressure keeps spreading underground. Take groundwater, for example. When reservoirs drop too low, cities and farms often compensate by pumping more water from underground aquifers. At first, that sounds reasonable. The problem is many aquifers refill incredibly slowly. Some took thousands of years to accumulate naturally, and once too much groundwater gets removed, the land above can begin collapsing downward permanently. This is already happening across parts of California and Arizona. Entire sections of land have sunk by several feet over time because underground sediments compact after losing water pressure. The process looks slow from a human perspective, but infrastructure notices. Canals crack, pipelines warp, roads buckle unevenly. Bridges experience stress they were never designed for. In some farming regions, subsidence has become so severe that water delivery canals themselves lose efficiency because the ground underneath physically changed shape. The West is basically deforming under long-term water loss. And honestly, the scale of groundwater depletion across the Southwest is difficult to emotionally process. Humans have been removing underground water faster than nature can replace it for decades. Some aquifers are now declining so rapidly, scientists worry parts of the region may face permanent reductions in groundwater storage capacity. Not temporary shortages, permanent geological change. That's what makes this story feel bigger than drought alone. The landscape itself is transforming, and layered on top of all that is tectonic stress already built into the western United States naturally. California's fault systems remain active. Nevada's crust continues stretching slowly apart. Utah and Arizona contain networks of ancient faults capable of movement under the right conditions. Most of these systems operate independently from reservoir levels. Scientists are very careful about exaggerating direct cause and effect relationships. But geological systems don't exist in isolation either. Pressure changes matter, stress redistribution matters. The Earth responds to shifting loads whether humans notice or not. That's why researchers increasingly study the interaction between climate stress and geology together instead of treating them as separate subjects. Because water itself is part of the mechanical behavior of the crust. It affects weight, pressure, friction underground, sediment stability, even fault sensitivity in some cases. And the western United States has spent the last century massively rearranging where water exists across the landscape. Gigantic dams trapped rivers. Aquifers were pumped continuously. Entire cities appeared in deserts that historically could not support that scale of population naturally. Now the system is straining under prolonged drought and rising temperatures. Lake Mead and Lake Powell became symbols of that strain because they are visible. You can literally watch the water disappearing year after year. But the deeper problem is less visible. The Southwest increasingly looks like a region trying to maintain modern civilization while the physical landscape underneath slowly changes, and scientists worry about long-term compounding effects. Hydropower declines as reservoirs fall lower. Water shortages intensify political pressure between states. Agricultural regions struggle to maintain irrigation. Extreme heat increases evaporation even faster. Meanwhile, the geology underneath keeps adjusting to all these shifts quietly in the background. Not dramatically. Not like a Hollywood disaster movie. More like a giant machine slowly moving out of balance. And maybe that's what feels most unsettling about the American West right now. Nothing collapses all at once. The pressure builds gradually. A reservoir drops lower each summer. A city pumps deeper underground. The ground sinks another inch. A fault produces another tiny earthquake. Another heat wave arrives earlier than expected. Each change feels manageable by itself, but together they begin forming a pattern scientists can no longer ignore.